Growing up in a small lakeside town in Michigan, my childhood felt like something out of a storybook. Every weekend, we'd pile into the car and head to my grandparents' lake house, where the air smelled of pine trees and the water sparkled under the sun. My dad would take me fishing on the dock, not just for fun but to teach me life lessons. Patience is key, he'd say with a wink, as I struggled to reel in a stubborn fish. Meanwhile, Mom was always there with her famous turkey sandwiches, my favorite, and little handwritten notes tucked inside my lunchbox that read things like, "You're stronger than you think." Family game nights were sacred. Every Friday, our living room transformed into a battlefield of laughter and playful rivalry. Dad would act overly dramatic when he lost at Monopoly, while Mom quietly strategized to win. And every night before bed, they took turns reading me stories, their voices soft and comforting. It wasn't perfect, sometimes they argued over bills or chores, but it was home. It was love. I never doubted that I was the center of their world. But cracks began to form when I turned 10. At first, it was subtle. Dad started coming home later and later, his tie loosened and his smile strained. Mom became quieter, retreating into herself like a turtle pulling back into its shell. One evening, I heard muffled sobs from their bedroom. I stood frozen outside the door, clutching my stuffed bear, too scared to knock. The next day, everything changed. Sitting me down in the kitchen, Mom's eyes red and swollen, she told me Dad had fallen in love with someone else, a woman named Tanya from his office. The shock hit me like a freight train. How could the man who taught me how to cast a fishing line suddenly abandon us? Even worse, weeks later, I accidentally stumbled across a text message on Dad's phone. It was from Tanya, filled with emojis and words I didn't fully understand yet. That moment planted a seed of betrayal deep inside me, one that would grow into an unshakable storm in the years to come. The aftermath of my parents' divorce hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me adrift in a sea of confusion and betrayal. I was only 10 years old when the life I had known shattered into pieces. The day Mom sat me down in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she told me about Dad's affair with Tanya, felt like the end of the world. I remember standing there, clutching the edge of the counter, trying to make sense of what she was saying. My father, my hero, the man who taught me how to fish and read bedtime stories, had betrayed us. He chose someone else over our family. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Our once bustling home became eerily quiet. Mom tried to hold herself together for my sake, but I could see the cracks beneath her brave facade. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the oak tree in our backyard, lost in thought. Meanwhile, Dad moved out, taking most of his belongings and leaving behind an empty void where his presence used to be. At first, I clung to hope. Every evening, I called him, desperate to hear his voice, to feel some semblance of normalcy. But more often than not, he didn't answer. When he did, his responses were curt, distracted, as if I were interrupting something far more important. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't a priority anymore. One incident stands out vividly in my memory, a wound that still stings even now. It was my birthday, just a few months after the separation. I woke up excited, expecting Dad to show up with balloons or maybe even take me out for ice cream like he always did. Instead, he forgot. Not only did he fail to call, but he also missed picking me up for our scheduled weekend visit. When I finally reached him later that evening, his excuse was flimsy. "Work got busy," he said, his tone dismissive. That moment crushed me. For the first time, I truly understood, I wasn't important to him anymore. Dad's transformation was staggering. Before the divorce, he was the kind of father every kid dreamed of, attentive, playful, loving. He'd wake me up with bear hugs and silly jokes, making mornings feel magical. But post-divorce, those moments vanished. On weekends, he showed up late, carrying impersonal gifts, a generic puzzle set one week, a random book the next, as if material things could fill the emotional chasm between us. His smiles felt forced, his laughter hollow. Even worse, he began talking about Tanya constantly, praising her cooking, her organizational skills, her kindness. Each mention felt like a dagger, reminding me that she had taken his heart, and indirectly, mine. Mom, on the other hand, became my anchor during this storm. Despite her own pain, she never spoke ill of Dad or Tanya in front of me. Instead, she encouraged me to maintain a relationship with him. "Your dad made a mistake," she'd say gently, "but he's still your father. It's okay to love him." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened my internal conflict. Part of me wanted to stay loyal to Mom, to shield her from further hurt by rejecting Dad completely. Yet another part yearned for the connection we once shared. This tug-of-war inside me was exhausting, leaving me emotionally drained. Then came the courtroom showdown, a scene etched permanently in my mind. Sitting outside the hearing room, I fidgeted nervously, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit Mom had given me years ago. Through the closed door, I could hear raised voices, the sharp tones of lawyers arguing over custody arrangements and property division. Suddenly, a snippet of conversation drifted through the crack in the door. Dad's attorney mentioned that he was willing to sacrifice everything to be with Tanya, including losing primary custody of me. My heart sank. Sacrifice everything? Did that include me? That revelation haunted me for days. It confirmed what I had feared all along. Dad's love for Tanya outweighed his love for me. The realization ignited a firestorm of emotions, anger, sadness, fear, all swirling inside me like a hurricane. I wanted to scream, to cry, to confront him, but I couldn't find the words. So instead, I buried my feelings deep within, building walls around my heart to protect myself from further pain. Looking back, I realize how much Mom sacrificed to keep me grounded during those turbulent times. She shielded me from bitterness, urging me to forgive without forgetting. Her strength inspired me, even though I didn't fully appreciate it then. Now, as an adult preparing for my own wedding, I understand the magnitude of her sacrifice. She gave up so much, not just for herself, but for me, to ensure I grew up with a sense of stability amidst chaos. Living with Dad and Tanya became a minefield of emotions, where every interaction felt like walking on thin ice. At first, Tanya tried to win me over with extravagant gestures, gifts that screamed, "Look at how much I care," but only made me feel suffocated. One Christmas, she gave me a $300 designer handbag, something I would never use because it didn't align with my practical lifestyle. When I thanked her politely but left the bag untouched in my closet, she sighed dramatically, saying, "I just want you to feel special, Lily." Her words sounded sweet, but they carried an undertone of expectation, as if rejecting her gift meant rejecting her as a person. The tension escalated when Tanya started insisting we do mother-daughter activities together. She booked us for a spa day at a luxurious resort in Malibu, complete with facials, massages, and lunch by the pool. On paper, it sounded dreamy, but for me, it was a nightmare. The thought of sitting across from her, pretending everything was fine while she called herself my mom, made my stomach churn. That morning, I woke up feeling nauseous, not from illness, but from sheer dread. I texted Richard, my fiancé now, confessing how trapped I felt. He replied, "You don't owe her anything. Do what feels right for you." So, I faked a stomachache and begged off at the last minute, claiming food poisoning. It wasn't noble, but it saved me from hours of forced intimacy I wasn't ready for. What hurt most was how Tanya weaponized her miscarriage against me. After losing the baby at 20 weeks, a tragedy that devastated both her and Dad, she began using it as emotional leverage. Once, during a family dinner at their house in Santa Monica, she turned to me with tears streaming down her face and said, "I had hoped this baby would bring us closer. But after losing it, I realized how much I need you in my life. You're all I have left." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Part of me sympathized with her pain. I couldn't imagine the grief of losing a child, but another part of me resented being guilt-tripped into filling a role I never asked for. Was I supposed to replace her unborn baby? Was I now responsible for healing her wounds? Dad's role in all this only deepened my frustration. Instead of mediating between us, he consistently sided with Tanya, pressuring me to be more understanding. During one heated argument, Tanya accused me of being cold-hearted because I refused to call her Mom. Dad chimed in, his voice sharp with disappointment. "Lily, why can't you give her a chance? She's been nothing but kind to you." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they dismissed my feelings entirely. To him, my refusal wasn't about protecting my boundaries, it was about punishing Tanya. And yet, how could I explain to him that calling someone Mom who wasn't my mother felt like betraying the woman who had raised me? One particularly explosive moment came during a summer trip to Lake Tahoe, where Dad rented a cabin for a weekend getaway. Tanya sat me down on the porch overlooking the lake and said, "I've always hoped we'd become a real family, you, your dad, and me. Don't you think it's time we moved past all this?" Her tone was gentle, but her words felt like shackles binding me to a future I didn't want. I stared at her, speechless, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. Did she truly believe I wanted to erase the memory of my mom? Or was she so desperate for validation that she couldn't see how her demands were tearing me apart? Looking back, I realized Tanya's actions stemmed from insecurity. She wanted to prove, to herself, to Dad, maybe even to society, that she could be the perfect stepmother, the missing piece in our fractured family puzzle. But her efforts weren't about building a genuine connection, they were about control. Every gift, every activity, every tearful confession was a calculated move to force me into accepting her as my mother. And while I understood her motivations intellectually, emotionally, I felt manipulated and used. Through it all, Mom remained my anchor. When I vented to her about Tanya's latest attempt to guilt-trip me, she listened without judgment. "It's okay to set boundaries, Lily," she'd say. You don't have to sacrifice your peace for someone else's comfort. Her wisdom gave me strength, even when I doubted myself. Without her, I might have crumbled under the weight of Tanya's expectations. The storm that had been brewing for years finally erupted into a full-blown hurricane as my wedding approached. The decision about who would walk me down the aisle became the epicenter of all unresolved tensions between me, Dad, and Tanya. It wasn't just a logistical detail, it was symbolic of everything we'd been fighting over for nearly 2 decades. I had chosen Mom to accompany me on this monumental day, a choice that felt natural and deeply rooted in our bond. But when I broke the news to Dad and Tanya during one of our rare family dinners at their house in Santa Monica, the air turned toxic within seconds. Dad slammed his fist on the dining table, a sound so sharp it made me flinch, and glared at me with an intensity one hadn't seen since childhood. "How can you do this, Lily? After everything Tanya has done for you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Beside him, Tanya sat rigid, tears streaming down her face as she whispered through choked sobs, "You're breaking my heart, Lily. How could you treat me like this after all these years?" Her words were laced with guilt, each syllable designed to pierce straight through my resolve. For a moment, I felt the weight of their combined disappointment pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Yet, deep inside, I knew I couldn't compromise on something so profoundly personal. The argument escalated quickly, turning into a verbal battlefield where no one emerged unscathed. Tanya accused me of being selfish, claiming that by excluding her, I was invalidating years of effort she'd poured into building a relationship with me. She brought up every gift she'd ever given me, that leather jacket you loved last Christmas, the art supplies I bought because you mentioned painting once. As if tallying them up would somehow prove her love. Then, in a desperate bid to sway me, she dropped the ultimate emotional bomb: "If you let me walk you down the aisle, I promise I'll never ask for anything else from you." Her statement hit me like a freight train. Was she seriously trying to blackmail me into submission? My stomach churned as I realized the depth of manipulation she was willing to employ. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm despite the chaos swirling around me. But before I could respond, Dad interjected, his tone icy and cutting. "Lily, if you can't accept Tanya as your mother, then maybe you shouldn't consider me your father anymore." His words sliced through me like a knife, leaving me breathless. The room seemed to spin as I replayed his threat in my mind. Not consider him my father? After everything we'd been through, the weekends spent fishing, the late-night talks about school and life, how could he say such a thing? It felt like a betrayal deeper than any I'd experienced before. In that moment, I saw clearly how much Dad had changed. He wasn't the man who used to tuck me into bed or cheer me on at school plays. He was someone else entirely, someone who prioritized Tanya's feelings over mine without hesitation. Desperate to escape the suffocating tension, I suggested meeting Tanya at a local cafe near my college campus, a place filled with memories of happier times. I hoped it might serve as neutral ground for us to clear the air. At first, things seemed promising. Tanya arrived wearing a soft smile, clutching a cup of chamomile tea. She even admitted that she understood my reasons for choosing Mom and apologized for pushing too hard. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe we might find common ground. But then, disaster struck. Out of nowhere, Tanya proposed that I walk her down the aisle at their upcoming vow renewal ceremony, a bizarre suggestion that left me speechless. "It's only fair," she reasoned, her voice tinged with desperation. "Your wedding is your special day, but this could be ours. We could finally have the connection we've always wanted." Her words sent shockwaves through me. Did she truly think I'd agree to such a twisted trade-off? I tried to explain that a daughter's wedding and a parent's vow renewal weren't interchangeable events, but she wouldn't listen. Instead, she doubled down, accusing me of being cold-hearted and ungrateful. As the conversation spiraled out of control, Tanya unleashed another torrent of guilt-tripping rhetoric. She revisited her miscarriage yet again, describing in excruciating detail how losing the baby had shattered her dreams of motherhood. "I thought having a child would bring us closer," she confessed, her voice cracking. "But now I realize I've missed my chance to truly be a mother." Her admission should have evoked sympathy, but instead, it fueled my frustration. Why was she still using her tragedy as leverage against me? Hadn't I suffered enough watching my own family crumble? In a surge of raw emotion, I snapped. "Stop using the miscarriage to manipulate me," I shouted, my voice echoing through the cafe. Yes, it was devastating, for all of us. But that doesn't give you the right to demand I call you Mom or force me into roles I don't want. The words spilled out uncontrollably, years of pent-up resentment finally finding release. Tanya froze, her eyes wide with shock, before bursting into tears and storming out of the cafe. I sat there, trembling, overwhelmed by a mix of guilt, anger, and relief. Later that evening, Dad called me, his tone venomous. "You've gone too far, Lily. Tanya is devastated, and it's your fault." If you cared even a little, you'd apologize. His accusations stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how blind he'd become to my pain. I tried to explain my perspective, but he cut me off mid-sentence. Fine, he spat. If you can't accept Tanya as your mother, then perhaps you shouldn't consider me your father either. Those words haunted me for days. They stripped away any lingering hope that Dad might understand my side. Yet, amidst the turmoil, I found clarity. This wasn't just about the aisle, it was about setting boundaries and protecting my emotional well-being. With Richard's unwavering support and Mom's quiet wisdom, I resolved to stand firm. I sent Dad and Tanya a carefully worded message outlining my feelings and expectations. If they couldn't respect my decision, they wouldn't be invited to the wedding. A few weeks later, Dad showed up unannounced at my apartment, looking haggard and defeated. He confessed that Tanya had left him, unable to cope with the rejection. As he spoke, I noticed a vulnerability in him I hadn't seen in years. But the real bombshell came when he admitted why they tried so hard to have a baby. Tanya believed it would help you accept her as a mother figure, he said, his voice heavy with regret. We were wrong to try to replace you, Lily. I see that now. The revelation shook me to my core. It explained so much: the relentless pressure to bond with Tanya, the constant comparisons to a real family, the guilt trips following the miscarriage. But it also ignited a fresh wave of anger. How could they think manipulating my emotions was acceptable? Despite the hurt, I agreed to give Dad another chance, to start rebuilding our fractured relationship, one small step at a time. The fallout from the wedding conflict hit harder than I ever imagined. One Saturday afternoon, just weeks before my big day, Dad showed up unannounced at my apartment in Los Angeles. His appearance shocked me. He looked like a shadow of the man I once knew. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he clutched a crumpled letter. Tanya left me, he confessed, his voice cracking under the weight of despair. She said she couldn't handle the rejection anymore, your rejection. Each word felt like a punch to the gut. Part of me wanted to scream, "Isn't this what you deserve?" after years of watching him prioritize Tanya over me. But another part of me, a softer, more vulnerable part, ached for him. Seeing my father, a man who had always been so strong and self-assured, reduced to tears was unbearable. He sat on my couch, head in his hands, muttering apologies and blaming himself for everything that had gone wrong. I messed up, Lily. I messed up with you, with Tanya, with everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the real bombshell came when he revealed why they had tried so hard to have a baby after the miscarriage. Tanya thought having a child would help you accept her as a mother figure, he admitted, shame etched across his face. We were wrong to try to replace you. I see that now. The revelation left me reeling. It explained so much: the relentless pressure to bond with Tanya, the constant comparisons to a real family, the guilt trips following the miscarriage. But it also ignited a fresh wave of anger. How could they think manipulating my emotions was acceptable? As I processed his confession, I felt torn between triumph and guilt. On one hand, Tanya leaving felt like justice served, proof that her attempts to force a maternal connection were doomed from the start. On the other hand, seeing my father's pain made me question whether I had been too harsh. Was it fair to hold them accountable for their mistakes, or was I simply perpetuating the cycle of hurt? The wedding day arrived, a crisp autumn morning in Los Angeles, with golden sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of the church. As I stood at the entrance, clutching a bouquet adorned with a small photo frame of my childhood family, Mom, Dad, and me smiling by the lake, I felt a whirlwind of emotions: excitement, nervousness, and an undercurrent of unresolved tension. My mother, radiant in her navy blue dress, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze before we began our walk down the aisle. Every step felt monumental, as if I was not just walking toward Richard but also stepping into a new chapter of healing and self-discovery. When I reached the altar, I glanced at the front row where my father sat. His eyes were red-rimmed, glistening with unshed tears, but he managed a faint smile, a fragile yet genuine attempt to celebrate my happiness despite his own pain. It struck me then how much he had aged over the years, the weight of regret etched deeply into his face. For a brief moment, our gazes locked, and I saw a flicker of hope, a silent plea for forgiveness that I wasn't ready to fully grant, but one I couldn't ignore either. After the ceremony, the reception buzzed with laughter and music, though beneath the surface, there was an undeniable undertone of fragility. I noticed my father lingering near the dessert table, sipping coffee alone while occasionally glancing at me from across the room. At one point, he approached Mom, thanking her for raising such a remarkable daughter. Their conversation was brief but cordial, a small miracle considering their history. Watching them interact without hostility filled me with relief. It was proof that progress, however incremental, was possible. Later that evening, as guests danced under twinkling fairy lights, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. This day wasn't just about marrying Richard, it was about reclaiming my voice and setting boundaries that honored both my past and future. The decision to exclude Tanya from the wedding hadn't been easy, but it was necessary for my emotional well-being. Still, as I checked my phone before bed, I discovered a text from her. "Congratulations, Lily. Maybe someday we can talk." Her words hung in the air, ambiguous yet loaded with possibility. Did she mean it? Or was this another attempt to manipulate? I chose not to respond, for now, at least. In the weeks following the wedding, Dad and I began rebuilding our relationship, one cautious dinner at a time. We agreed to focus solely on us, leaving Tanya out of our conversations. It wasn't perfect, there were moments of awkward silence and lingering guilt, but it was a start. Through this process, I realized something profound: forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing past wrongs. It means choosing to move forward with clarity and compassion, even when the scars remain.